The Ojibwe Indians who roamed its tree-lined banks called it Mississippi, Great River. Only a few miles from its source, the river already expands, spreads its banks and deepens its channel, as if eager to prove the right to its name. For more than 2,000 miles from Lake Itasca to the Gulf of Mexico, the mighty Mississippi slices through the heartland of the United States. A broad and moving ribbon that glides past an ever-changing panorama of scenic wonders. Rich farmlands, busy cities, and picturesque river towns. The Mississippi, a blessing to millions of Americans who live, who work, and who play along its banks. And frolic upon its wide expanses. The Mississippi, source of water that sustains human life. Source of water necessary to industry. Providing a broad natural highway for moving supplies and products vital to the economic progress of mid-America. This great river and its scores of tributary rivers and streams forms the network of the Upper Mississippi River Basin. During the pioneer years, when the United States was being shaped, it was only natural that man chose to settle alongside the rivers. Men built their lives, homes, cities, and businesses on the banks of this massive inland waterway. The Mississippi and its tributaries have kept faith with those it serves by supplying answers to many of mankind's needs and desires. Great river, father of waters, the mighty Mississippi, serene in the sunset hush of its gently flowing waters. Until it becomes a terrifying maelstrom of roiling, ugly water. Violent, cruel, a destroyer of land, property, and human life. Residents of the Upper Mississippi River Basin will long remember 1965 as the year of the Big Flood. Earlier floods of 1950 and 1952 had smashed previous high water and property damage records. some of them dating back to 1880. But the big flood of April 1965 was to be greater, of longer duration, and even more devastating than any upper Mississippi River flood in the memory of man. The river turned killer spilled from its banks, inundated 3 million acres of some of America's most productive farmland, invaded some 125 cities and towns, paralyzed rail, highway, and river transportation, caused the deaths of 15 persons, and damaged or destroyed $157 million worth of public and private property. Later, after the angry waters had receded, leaving millions of tons of foul-smelling mud and rotting debris, river residents asked each other, what is it that makes a normally friendly river go on periodic rampages? How did the big flood of 1965 happen? It started with snow. During March, snow fell almost every day. Throughout that month, many parts of Minnesota and Wisconsin received 3 times their average snowfall. Billions of tons of wet, heavy snow covered the area, a water equivalent of 4 to 11 inches. The earth beneath the moisture-laden snowpack was solidly frozen to depths of 2 to 4 feet. Thus, billions of gallons of melted snow, which in an average year are absorbed by the earth, would instead this year seriously overload streams and rivers. The hope was for a slow warm-up that would melt the snow cover gradually. Instead, more snow. The outlook was grim, with a forecast in mid-March for a general potential flood of 2 feet over flood stage throughout the entire Mississippi River basin in Minnesota. The public was forewarned. As new information came in from the field, it became obvious that the threat of a major flood was mounting fast. The predictions were regularly updated. Forecasts were tragically accurate. The big flood of 1965 was underway. In order to understand how the flood occurred, we must look at the area's river geography. It is a region laced with countless small streams that flow into larger rivers, which in turn empty into the Mississippi. This network of moving water drains vast areas in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, Illinois, and Missouri that comprise the upper Mississippi River basin. Weeks before the epic flood, the State of Minnesota Office of Civil Defense had sponsored a pre-disaster conference with state, county, and municipal officials. Personnel of the U.S. Weather Bureau compiled data on expected river crests and issued a complete flood forecast. Corps of Engineers and the Weather Bureau then defined the flood threat and pointed out the areas likely to be hardest hit. The Corps outlined step-by-step procedures that would prevent or at least lessen large-scale property damage. District engineers visited threatened areas to advise officials of the seriousness of the impending flood threat to their area and to stress the importance of advanced preparation. Through television, radio, newspapers, the U.S. Weather Bureau and the engineers alerted and advised the public. What it takes to fight a flood is sand. Millions of cubic yards of sand and earth, and burlap, and shovels, trucks, equipment, know-how, and sweat. Unpaid volunteers bent their backs, many of them working around the clock. Once a flood begins, the time for flood control has long since passed. About all the town can do is build its defenses and ready itself for the inevitable. Then, the worst thing possible happened. Rain. In sections of southern and central Minnesota, up to 1 inch fell within a 24-hour period. During the flood, 5 inches of rain fell in some areas. On April 9th, waters of the Minnesota and Blue Earth rivers rose to over 29 feet at Mankato, the highest stage since 1881. Downriver, the Minnesota hit St. Peter, Henderson, Carver, Chaska, Shakopee, and Savage. Other rivers overflowed. The Zumbro, the Crow, St. Croix, Chippewa, Cottonwood, Root, Upper Iowa, Kickapoo, and Wisconsin. The St. Croix alone added about 1.25 billion gallons of water per hour to the already swollen Mississippi. When the flood's full fury struck, new high water marks were recorded in community after community. La Crosse, Wisconsin, nearly 6 feet above the flood stage. Rock Island, Illinois, and Davenport, Iowa, over 7.5 feet. Guttenberg, Iowa, more than 8 feet. Mankato, Minnesota, 11 feet. St. Paul, 12 feet. And at Savage, Minnesota, the water stood at more than 21 feet above the flood stage level. And so the flood fight went on. Man against nature on the loose in scores of communities along the Mississippi and its tributaries. Winona, Minnesota won its battle with the river, but only after waging a massive 8-day fight. Hundreds of volunteer workers placed 350,000 cubic yards of earth, filled and placed 1,300,000 sandbags, and used up to 100,000 square yards of plastic sheeting, building a 9-mile-long dike as high as 15 feet. When water seeped under the earthen dike, 57 portable pumps hurled the water back into the maddened river. The city estimates that the heroic flood fight cost about $2 million, but it prevented about $20 million worth of damage to public and private property. Tragically, in some communities, emergency flood fighting measures were too late, too little, or not at all. In some towns, volunteers and local authorities fought stubbornly and lost. Mankato, 240 acres of the city were inundated with water that rose above first-floor windows. Damaged were 62 industries, 1 high school, and 350 homes. 4,500 Mankato residents were displaced. At the small community of Carver, Minnesota, The river went 16 feet over flood stage and covered half of the town above the first floor. At Chaska, 1,500 persons were forced to flee their homes in haste when the dikes failed. Emergency dikes saved the city's sewage plant and its county courthouse. At Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin, some 250 homes were flooded, 1,000 people evacuated, and 59 business establishments damaged. Railroad traffic ground to a halt. Flood fighting is intensely personal. It's men and women fighting, sometimes with their bare hands, to save their town, their homes, their business firms, and their lives. During the flood of 1965, more than 100,000 residents of flooded communities worked until their backs ached, their hands blistered, and their eyes grew red from lack of sleep. Officers and men of the Minnesota, Iowa, Illinois, and Missouri National Guard performed rescue operations. More than 600 Corps of Engineer employees, aided by several thousand temporary employees, provided advice and assistance to officials in 65 flood localities and built emergency dikes at federal locks and dams along the river. The responsibilities of the Corps of Engineers in flood fighting are defined by federal law. The role of the Corps is to advise state and local authorities when requested to do so, and to assist when state or local authorities have exhausted their capabilities or are unable to cope with the flood situation. Thus, after all local resources were exhausted, the Corps furnished flood-besieged communities with sandbags, lumber, plastic sheeting, and other flood-fighting materials, in addition to trucks, pumps, portable lights, and hand tools. Coast Guard craft patrolled the river, rescuing the stranded and preventing looting. Navy, Air Force, and National Guard aircraft flew rescue and reconnaissance missions. At last, the savage brown waters began receding. After 22 days at St. Paul, a month at Clinton, Iowa, 6 weeks at Hannibal, Missouri, making the big flood of 1965 not only the most severe in upper Mississippi River history, but the longest as well. As residents began the dreary task of restoring their damaged homes and business firms, state, county, and local officials throughout the flood area began adding up the cost. The total was almost staggering. Throughout the upper Mississippi River above Hannibal, Missouri, damage to public and private property is estimated at more than $92 million. Damage to agriculture more than $44 million. And damage to transportation systems more than $21 million. In Minnesota alone, an estimated 21,000 families suffered property losses and 40,000 families required flood aid. Many thousands more in Wisconsin, Iowa, Illinois, and Missouri were forced to flee their homes. $157 million worth of damage is a monumentally tragic statistic. Yet behind that massive loss lies personal tragedy that can never be measured by dollars and cents. Money and time and sweat can rebuild a flood-battered community. Soap, water, and elbow grease will remove the dirty brown marks. But the emotional scars of the flood survivors, do they ever really heal? How does one measure that kind of loss in dollars? Fighting the big flood cost the affected states and communities some $11 million, a tremendous sum. However, that $11 million prevented more than $260 million worth of damage that surely would have resulted had it not been for the emergency dikes that were constructed along the Mississippi and its tributaries. May 1965 was beautiful. The sun had warmed the land. The rivers were returning to normal. Most area residents pushed memories of the flood into the dim recesses of their minds. Except those who had suffered through the nightmare of angry water that crept, crawled, eddied, and swirled through the streets and buildings of their town. Many of the more thoughtful asked the question, can we make this flood the last flood? The Corps of Engineers was established in 1775. In 1824, it was made responsible for maintaining the nation's navigable rivers while conserving river resources. In 1936, the Corps was assigned the additional responsibility for assisting states and communities in developing and carrying out local flood control programs. The Corps of Engineers employs several techniques for controlling floods. However, one of the most effective methods for water conservation and reduction of downstream levels during flood periods is to store the excess water in reservoirs, holding it until the river levels have subsided. In addition to reducing floods, where reservoirs are feasible and desirable, they can serve an area in many other ways. They can provide industrial and municipal water supplies, water for power generation, irrigation, recreation and conservation of fish and wildlife. Hundreds of these man-made lakes have been constructed. The combined shorelines of such reservoirs now in use by the public across our nation already is nearly 3 times the distance of the United States coastline, from Maine to the state of Washington. Rivers are nature's gift to man. However, if man hopes to be able to continue using the magnificent resources of our nation's rivers, he must learn to utilize floodplain lands in such a way as to minimize the potential for periodic flood damage. Playgrounds, picnic areas, and baseball diamonds suffer little or no damage if flooded occasionally, and can be easily cleaned up and restored to use. Naturally, not all floodplain land can be devoted to recreation facilities. Floodplain information reports will provide sound advice for proper land use by the local community. In many locations, it may require upstream reservoirs, local levees, or flood walls, as well as regulations to resolve the conflict between man and nature over the use of the floodplain. While state and local officials, assisted by the Corps of Engineers, tackle problems of floodplain management and flood control planning, federal authorities are meeting the immense challenge of conserving and utilizing all the nation's waterways. In 1962, Congress assigned responsibility for developing and coordinating this broad and large-scale planning to the Corps of Engineers. Included is the Upper Mississippi Basin Study. Partners in this gigantic undertaking are the United States Departments of Commerce, Agriculture, Interior, Health, Education, and Welfare, the Federal Power Commission, and the 7 states that comprise the Upper Mississippi River Basin. Floodplain management, flood control planning, and Upper Mississippi River Basin development are the responsibility of everyone, from Main Street to the state capitol to Washington, D.C. A community must become familiar with the flood hazards of its river if it hopes to exist alongside the river in relative peace and tranquility. Man will always be plagued by floods. But wise use of floodplain lands, combined with modern flood control measures, hopefully can reduce future damage of the magnitude of the big flood of 1965, and can change the face of the other side of the river.